My name is Dawn Carey. I have the joy of serving as Associate Director of the Dickey Center. My pillar is Global Health and Development here. I'm a class of 1986 alumna and returned to Dartmouth almost 14 years ago. I got to work here both as faculty and staff and also getting my MPH here, so I'm a lucky double green person here. In addition to my role at the Dickey Center, I get to teach in the geography and biology departments, and I serve as faculty director for our student group, the Dartmouth Coalition for Global Health. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our class of 1950 Senior Foreign Affairs lecture this afternoon, Uncovering Lessons from the COVID War, a conversation with Philip Zelikow and Kendall Hoyt. Before we get started, however, I want to take time to honor the reason we even get to do this. Our class of 50 fellows and the class of 1950 whose generosity made it possible for us to even collect here. The class of 1950 Senior Foreign Affairs Fellowship is made possible, oddly enough, by the class of 1950. They were the first class to have John Sloan Dickey as their president for their entire Dartmouth career. They've been inspired by him since the moment they set foot here on the Hanover Plain and continue to lead lives engaged in world affairs, and this generosity reflects that. I am very pleased to say that we have representation from the class of 1950 joining us here. We have Doug Smith, class of 1950, and his wonderful wife, Meredith Smith, as well. Thank you both so much. The goal of this lecture series is to animate a discussion of a great issue. It's really part of hosting a distinguished visitor in any way. We've had a range of distinguished speakers, including Ambassador Bisa Williams, former diplomat and current advisor to the Carter Center, former career diplomat and Deputy Secretary of State William J. Burns, today head of the CIA, discussing diplomacy, Francis Ulmer, the former Lieutenant Governor of Alaska, discussing climate change, and Lisa Monaco, former White House advisor to President Obama, today Deputy Attorney General on counterterrorism. As many of you know, perhaps all of you in this room, the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding unites the community with the strengths of Dartmouth to broaden and deepen the scope of learning and exploration within and outside the college. We do this through advanced study, interdisciplinary collaboration, research innovation, and respect for a diversity of viewpoints as we collectively address the world's challenges. One might suggest that the challenge of a global pandemic serves as a perfect way of highlighting some of this work. With that in mind, I am honored to introduce our esteemed conversants for the afternoon. They are poised to unwrap many of the features and findings of the COVID pandemic. Sitting here in front of me here is Dartmouth professor Kendall Hoyt, who serves as faculty director for the Dickey Center's Global Health Initiative's Pandemic Security Project. She also holds the positions of assistant professor at Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, and at Dartmouth, and a senior lecturer at the Thayer School of Engineering at Dartmouth as well. She teaches courses on biosecurity, health systems, and technological innovation. She wrote the 2012 book, Long Shot, Vaccines for National Defense, eerily prescient, and is one of the 35 practitioners and scholars who co-authored the just published book that we're here to discuss, Lessons from the COVID War, an investigative report. The report stemmed from the work of the COVID Commission, now known as the COVID Crisis Group. Please welcome Kendall Hoyt. We are delighted that the hand that held the pen for those 35 voices joins us here on stage today. Philip Zelikow. As director of the COVID Crisis Group, he's on familiar ground, having also served as director of the 9/11 Commission. Mr. Zelikow is the White Burkett Miller Professor of History at the University of Virginia, where he also served as Dean of the Graduate School and Director of the Miller Center. His scholarly work is focused on critical episodes in American and world history. His career is an extraordinary path of service and impact, including trial and appellate lawyer, career diplomat, academic at Harvard, then Virginia. Throughout all of this, he continues to serve at all levels of American government, furthering bipartisan collaboration over 5 administrations, with positions in the White House, State Department, and the Pentagon. Notably, his last full-time government position was as the counselor of the Department of State, Deputy to Secretary Condoleezza Rice. He's one of the few individuals ever to serve on the President's intellectual advisory boards for presidents of both parties in the administrations of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He also has been a member of the Defense Policy Board for Defense Secretary Ashton Carter and a member of the board of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In 2020, he was elected a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy. Please welcome Philip Zelikow. Last and most definitely not least, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague and the Norman E. McCulloch Jr., Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, Victoria Holt. Tori Holt joined Dartmouth in 2021, bringing with her a deep understanding of public policy, leadership, and diplomacy. In Washington, D.C., her time there included serving as vice president at the Simpson Center, institute focused on international affairs, where she directed the Transforming Conflict and Governance program. She also served at the State Department from 2009 to 2017, including the role of Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security, Bureau of International Organizational Affairs. She's also led the development of U.S. diplomatic initiatives, including the 2015 Leaders Summit on UN Peacekeeping, hosted by President Obama to increase capacity for UN operations. Please welcome Tori Holt. We're going to begin our deep dive by inviting Philip up to the podium here to set the stage for the discussion. This book is the first bipartisan account of the pandemic, from origins to Operation Warp Speed. It not only provides not just a diagnosis, but also some prescriptions for moving forward. Philip, I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, will the microphone work all right if I step out here? I think it's all right. Can all of you hear me in the back? That's great. I thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Dawn. And I'm going to embarrass Dawn because there was an important verbal stumble in Dawn's introduction of me. She said that I had been a member one of the few people who have served on a particular board for both Republican and Democratic presidents, and she called it the President's Intellectual Advisory Board. And I have to say that it would gladden the heart of many of my academic colleagues if they believed the president had an intellectual advisory board. It is my sad duty to report that actually this is the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. And it is my further kind of unfortunate task to explain that an intellectual advisory board is sadly not synonymous with intelligence. We're talking a little bit about this report today, and of course, media people ask me, well, I'm busy. Can you just summarize the one takeaway from this report? And then I usually say something like preparedness. So then I thought about what does preparedness mean? So a member of our group explained preparedness to me this way. Well, he's Robert Rodriguez, who does emergency medicine out at UCSF. So a common situation that they train for in emergency medicine is what happens in chest trauma. In chest trauma, you frequently have a patient who presents with a condition called pneumothorax. In the pneumothorax, what's happened then is one of your lungs has collapsed because it's been punctured by something. And therefore, you're breathing into your pleural cavity. And the deeper you breathe, the more you collapse your lungs and kill yourself. It presents with acute pain in your chest, bluish pallor, growing inability to breathe, and can result in death rather quickly. So, and chest trauma is not an uncommon kind of emergency condition. So, patient comes in presenting with these symptoms. You're a very smart person, and the patient urgently needs your help. If someone said, here, treat this patient. Here is a book on emergency medicine. This is an excellent textbook. Represents the best science. Save this person's life. Quickly. Your thumb, right? So then you drop the book to the ground and then they say, any amount of money to save this person's life. I'll give you $100,000. Here's the cash. If you can save this person's life. That doesn't help you. Like what you really want, like, what do I do? What do I do? Actually, what you need to do is you actually need to punch a needle into that person's chest with a fair amount of force. And actually, of course, if you think about it for a minute, you need a little training to do this. Because, if you just punch a needle somewhere in someone's chest hard, that could have a bad outcome. So you actually have to know a little bit more about, well, where do I, right? You think about it. The point is that in that moment, if you don't know what to do, and you are not trained in how to do it, and you don't have the equipment to do it, it doesn't matter if I give you science, and it doesn't matter if I give you money. You're not prepared. And that person will die. And that's, in a way, if you think about preparedness as knowing what to do and being able to do it, and in a way, that's actually the code that you can use to decipher what went wrong with America in the COVID war. Here we go. So these were the members of our group. We originally got together. You'll see Hoyt there on the middle of the middle line, at the very center of the group. Really a terrific group of folks from a variety of different disciplines. We were formed originally to prepare a national COVID commission at the beginning of 2021 with support from 4 foundations. We interviewed hundreds of people. We formed task forces. We wrote work plans. We did a ton of research. We had meetings of the whole group. We did all this work. And then we realized that there wasn't going to be a national COVID commission, at least not in the foreseeable future. And we had to decide whether to just hang it up and just kind of shrug our shoulders or to do something else. And what we decided last year, facing this, is, you know what, we actually think we have some insights on this. We should just write the report ourselves. And I can see a number of you have a copy. So I'm just going to do 10 quick takeaways to frame the conversation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is not a 40-minute lecture. But I just want to spend a few minutes just frame, so you get a sense of the scope of the thing and some of the key takeaways, so that then we can delve more deeply in the conversation with Kendall. Because Kendall gets bored at these banal superficialities. So, first key point. It's not about having the most science, and it's not about having the most money. Remember my story. It's about operational preparedness on a gigantic scale. Lesson 2. The basic bones of the system we use to meet a national health emergency in America are the public health system that was created in its structural essence circa 1890 in the Cleveland administration. Now, and that's just a fundamental point. This is the actual executive authority and operational capabilities on the nationwide scale are simply fragmented among hundreds of state and local, tribal, and territorial entities. And actually, they are not themselves all alike. In fact, almost all of them differ from each other. Why? Because back then, public health was a job mainly of treating dirty water and mosquito-borne diseases. It was mainly done with fire and bulldozer and occasional inoculation campaigns, mounted usually at the state and local level, cleaning up tenements and things like that. And actually state and local authorities, which were very akin to the state militias, that were the way we defended ourselves in that era when we didn't even have a standing national army. We didn't have a standing national health army either. And we never created one in America. We're very different from other countries in this respect. We eventually created a research institution to support the state and local authorities, which is the institution we now know as the CDC. Actually, there was an earlier National Hygiene Laboratory that became the NIH. Then we created a CDC, and we put it in Atlanta because there were a lot of mosquito-borne diseases down in the South, and that was in 1946. But these were all entities that were research support entities for the executive operational work that were done in all these hundreds of entities, that 19th century design. So now comes a 21st century pandemic. And the CDC had sometimes even thought of itself as a national public health agency. And it was for sure blamed in the crisis for not being a good enough national public health agency. And in a way, on the one side, there was an illusion and a hope, but on the other side, there was actually a scapegoat. Because the CDC was not a national public health agency, at an executive and operational level, we don't have a national public health agency in America. We're not set up that way. And we never were. So then what happened at CDC in a way, and which was put very eloquently by the longtime career person there, Ann Schuchat, whom I talked to, who said, on the one side, there were things that they could do that were then rapidly outstripped by the scale of the crisis, really within the first days or weeks. And we needed strategic level governance that could organize all the different parts of the government together on this. So there's no strategic level governance to do that. Then they might make suggestions to people, but they had no executive authority or operational capabilities to carry out those suggestions. And all these entities are made up kind of according to their lights, and usually all over America they were being overwhelmed and replaced by various kinds of ad hoc governance authorities and systems. So 19th century meets 21st century. And then on top of that, they're trying to do crisis communication, and increasingly the Trump administration in Washington, and they were having their troubles with crisis communication. And in response to their troubles, the Trump administration harassed and censored them, which then just made it more difficult for them to figure out what to write. And they wrote things that were even more torturous than before, because if no one understands it, then you can't criticize it. That's a bit of hyperbole, but maybe not too much. Lesson 3. This is a deep point. When the pandemic hit, you could see immediately that a lot of the initial kind of outer layer of defenses were quickly overwhelmed by the scale of what was coming. And then we began using these blunt instruments with the initial lockdowns in the beginning of the second half of March. And there was actually a pretty broad public support for that for a time. The key point to stress is that after people started coming out of the lockdowns, and actually almost all the country started easing up the lockdowns during April and into early May, there really was no plan for what to do next. It's not like the government had a plan. Good medications to treat the disease were not yet available and not proven. There weren't really good toolkits readied and available all over America for how to make the trade-offs and mitigate this and manage actually what Marty Cetron here has called the middle game until you could get your war-winning weapons, your vaccines and powerful therapeutics deployed, which might take a long time. So what happened then in the crisis is that as they moved after this initial phase of turmoil and collective anxiety that all of you remember, it was just clear that the government was flailing because they were trying to figure out what to do, and even where they knew how to do it, the tools of many kinds were not readily available. In other words, kind of the needles and the training, even if they had the training, the needles weren't distributed, et cetera. And then into that void of not knowing what to do and reliance on blunt instruments, then all the toxic politics could flow in. And then it just became culture clashes. We have in the report what I think is as dispassionate and objective a guide to the origins controversy as you'll find. There are other good pieces that have been written on this, but I think ours remains reliable today. And we don't come down hard either way. And we explain what we think is the state of the evidence. And I think we had very good people behind this who are very knowledgeable about the state of what's known about this. And talking to members of our group, even now this week, we wouldn't amend anything that's in our chapter about this. But the point is that whatever you think of the origins controversy, it drives a forward-looking agenda for action and how to get warning of outbreaks overseas, because the system we had for warning of outbreaks, which relied on national reporting, decisively failed. So you need to envision a different system, and we make suggestions about that. And then on the other hand, whatever you think about the origins controversy, the whole thing spotlights the need to really pay a lot of attention now to the dangers of biological engineering and work through the risk-benefit calculation at the frontier of this in biosecurity and biosafety, and we have some things to say about that too. This is a controversial agenda for some in virology, but we think it's right. And the time has come. There's actually an analogous version of this conversation going on right now about AI. This is a focus on the federal level. And just to say bluntly, and I was just having a conversation about this before I came down with several people, including members of our group. Right now, to this day, we have not resolved the issues of who would be in charge in managing a pandemic in the federal government. That situation is no better right now than it was when the pandemic started, fundamentally, between all the different entities. Who is in charge, clarifying roles and missions. This doesn't necessarily require a grand new act of Congress to create a giant new federal agency. We have a lot of assets and capabilities, but the relations between them are really quite strained and unclear. To put it very simply, America entered the crisis with a public health enterprise, fragmented in the ways we described, in some ways set up to fail. And then we had a gigantic healthcare enterprise, which all of you know about, which was detached from the public health enterprise. Then we have a biopharma enterprise, which is detached in its management from the management of the healthcare enterprise and the management of the public health enterprise. And the only way you develop a strategy for beating the pandemic is to orchestrate all three of them in a common enterprise. We spent some time discussing the situation of the healthcare system, which is deeply concerning. The healthcare system basically operated on just-in-time inventories and had no surge capabilities to handle the stress of this crisis. A lot of things were revealed about emergency readiness, and a lot of frontline workers in the healthcare system then had to assume the burdens of fighting this battle, for which they were often overwhelmed. And a relatively small fraction of people had to shoulder a disproportionate part of that burden. And I'll just tell you, a number of our people who work on the front lines believe that the COVID crisis has now tipped America's healthcare system into a period of sustained crisis that is mostly invisible to the American people. It's showing up. The canary in the coal mine right now are chronic nursing shortages that are plaguing even the most affluent metro center medicals, like MGH, for example. Lesson 7. And this is one of the areas where Kendall made such a decisive contribution. If you want to be ready with your war-winning weapons, you better start building them while you're at peace. In a pandemic, literally every day counts. When you get into the economic numbers on this, the costs of a pandemic are so staggering that literally the cost and economic output of, if my vaccine is ready in 38 days instead of in 34 days, that can be the difference of tens of billions of dollars. That's how time sensitive this is. And so then the preparedness in order to be ready with your war-winning weapons before the war has to be treated like a national security problem. Of course, we don't wait until we go to war to build aircraft carriers. And we need to have that kind of mindset as we approach the biopharma enterprise. One of the things we stress in this report, and that really doesn't get anything like the discussion it needs, is how the public sector related to the private sector is at the heart of many of the key lessons from this war. Whether it was in quickly scaling up mass production of tests or managing the mass production of vaccines. And by the way, I think we have the best account that's available in print of the origins of Operation Warp Speed and what both worked about it and did not work about it. Lesson 8. This was a global war. From the start, it required a global strategy, which had to be led by a global coalition. I'm saying this on humane grounds, because there are a lot of people in the world, but I'm also saying it on very practical, selfish grounds, because the supply chains and the manufacturing combines for biopharma are multinational, deeply multinational. Actually, one of the ironies is the Buy America campaign actually backfired for American business. It actually ended up cutting American businesses out of the supply chains that would eventually satisfy most of the global demand for the vaccines. Lesson 9. So the good news is that over a lot of experience, we have established really good ways of learning how to do good crisis communication with focus groups and so on and tested messages. The bad news is we ignored all of those principles during this crisis. And then, of course, the Trump administration made it worse by pouring sulfuric acid on what it is we were doing. But then actually the Biden administration's crisis communication will not be studied as an example of how to do it. In part, there's a level at which people weren't applying the communication lessons they would apply in their political campaigns to, say, a campaign to persuade people to take vaccines. Operation Warp Speed had no activity to figure out the public campaign that would persuade people to use the vaccines. It was doing such a terrific job in manufacturing and distributing. Lesson 10. If any of you study research on what are the odds of another pandemic on a COVID scale, some of that research is now beginning to be published. And they actually give odds. I don't know if any of the numbers are reliable. They're all depressing. They would all tell, we're talking about not odds in the next 100 years, we're talking about odds in the next 10 years. And it's all significantly worrying. So the point then is that we need to learn these lessons. Now the good news, again, is that during the crisis, so many Americans worked on this in such interesting ways. We improvised and discovered a lot of things about what we can do, whether it's an Operation Warp Speed, whether it was an improvised state and local crisis management setups that shared real-time information and shared information about available hospital beds, all sorts of stuff that we learned during the crisis. We learned a lot of lessons during this war. The point of our report is we fear if those lessons aren't recorded and learned, they will be forgotten for next time. So, Kendall, let's talk about it some more.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That is a succinct but inspiring questions presentation. All right. Well, welcome. So, Kendall, I'm going to start with you. And thank you, Philip, for just kicking this off. It's such a rich report. And maybe before I ask Kendall the question, I mean, I think all of us have felt the devastation of what we've just been through, the lives lost, the desperation of our healthcare system, and the fear that it could come back. So thank you for all your work to help us prepare for not having that happen, at least not the way it happened just in the last 2 years. So Ken, let me ask you, Philip touched on Operation Warp Speed. And also I know that you've looked at medical countermeasures. Can you tell us a bit about what that was and what worked?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, that was the government organized program to accelerate the development of a vaccine. And I mean, it was a stunning success by all measures. I mean, we had 2 vaccines in 11 months, which is 1/10 of the average development time for a vaccine. And it was, unheard of. I mean, 10,000 things had to go right, 10,000 things went right. And most people would not have bet on that outcome. And it was a beautiful example of what government can do. It was one of the big improvisations here. We talk about the coordination problem, the lack of leadership. This is one area where a competent leader was given a budget, was given cross-agency, cross-sector authority, and was given political cover. And they got vaccines across the finish line. And they used they did the military thing. They did parallel procurement at risk, at high cost. And that was a gutsy thing to do, and it paid off. Now, it's easy to learn the wrong lesson from that. I mean, a lot of people will look at that and think, well, what's the problem? We'll just do that again next time. Mm-hmm. And I think I can tell you with certainty it would not work the same way with a different pathogen next time. We got extremely lucky with the science. We had been doing research, risky research, you might say, on other coronaviruses, MERS and SARS. And because we did that research, we had some idea about the vaccine target. We knew something about the spike protein. We knew that we needed to stabilize that spike protein. Thank you, Dartmouth. That was kind of remarkable. And so, we were able to, one thing to understand about these crash programs, they can apply new science, but they cannot generate it. So with a new pathogen, next time, if this were a different pathogen, we could still imagine we were still waiting for a vaccine. We could still be waiting for a vaccine. And these vaccines to date have saved 20 million lives. So imagine, a death rate that's double what we've had, triple what we've had. So, I think that's a very sobering thing. So it's really important to look at what Warp Speed did do, what is in our control, and make sure that we have those functions in government for next time. So having a portfolio, a proactive portfolio, establishing these partnerships with industry in advance. That's something that CEPI did. You guys know the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. They moved faster than Warp Speed right early on. They had contracts signed within 13 days of the sequence being posted by the Chinese scientist. And they did that because they had pre-existing contracts with other companies working on MERS, so they could pivot on that. Other companies working on mRNA, so they could pivot on that. And there's a lesson in that. And what they were able to do with the integrated command structure that they had. That's like having a point guard, calling the plays, when to shoot, when not to shoot, telling everyone what to do. That makes all the difference in the world. So those are things we need to carry forward. That is in our control. And so I think those would be our takeaways from that.
They had to do it in the Department of Defense because they didn't have the civilian governance, because civilian governance isn't operational enough, and HHS wasn't operational enough. So rather than kind of like, well, we'll just rely on DoD to do this in future, I think we would prefer actually to reform our civilian governance and make it better, rather than further militarize that process. So, and then I did want to do a little shout out on Warp Speed. By the way, that program no longer exists now. So there's a recreation of it that they put in HHS and whose future is uncertain. But one of the things that worked in that program was we distributed the vaccine through the American drugstore system in another public-private partnership, for which, by the way, a woman at CDC deserves a lot of credit, a woman named Anita Patel.
Well, you do use the analogy that to prepare for the future, it should be treated like a military kind of construct. And yet, obviously, the civilian side has to be able to function. And you've described these interlocking functional capabilities, healthcare, public health, and then the world of pharma. So can we just push a little further where you think that analogy works and where it stops? And what could we do to have those systems work well together in the future?
You want to take that? Why
Sure,
don't you lead
yeah.
off? Yeah.
So I think that analogy is really helpful when you're thinking about building something, procurement. You need parallel procurement. You need a portfolio. That's when the analogy is really helpful. One way in which it breaks down for me is, to your point, this is a global war, which is different. That's not a zero-sum game, or it's more, you can be far more effective and more powerful when you don't treat it like a zero-sum game, particularly in the area of, again, like pooled procurement, for example. So there are ways in which we are in a race against time and the virus and not each other. And as Chris Snyder knows, who is here, when you can have, public funders have incredible leverage to shape the market for public goods like vaccines. And so if instead it was, not just the United States, but say the United States and Germany and France and Switzerland, and, like, you get a coalition, and they can put together a fund to procure these vaccines. You can have a much more attractive offer to a larger number of manufacturers to maybe produce more than they would have under normal circumstances. And so you have a broader portfolio, you reduce your risk, you can reduce your cost, you can increase your access because you can then distribute on the basis of need. And I would say it's worth engaging in these ideas. You might want to just have a US only program, but do this also as an insurance policy. Because what if one of your vaccines fail? You can't really afford, maybe as a country, to do more than 5 or 6, but maybe the pooled procurement could do 35. And wouldn't you want that insurance policy? Or if we're doing just a US only based procurement program, let's have a concept for maybe developing enough, maybe not for the entire world, but for some of the world. And you do that not as philanthropy, but because it actually increases your strategic bargaining. It increases your ability to lead, both industrially and politically. And so I think we need to consider the rest of the world in these.
Very good. Yeah. You've talked about early warning systems. Can you tell us what that means?
Yeah, as I said, the system that relied on national reporting failed. one of the long-standing arguments that I think this crisis has spotlighted as to how do we get warning of where a pathogen might come from. There was a whole research program to try to discover pathogens with pandemic potential. And then what they would do is they would scour jungles and bat caves in difficult working conditions to get samples of exotic viruses, which they could then bring back to labs and test them to see if they had pandemic potential, if they mutated in certain ways. That research program enjoyed broad support before this pandemic. Now there are people who are worried that that research program may have caused this pandemic. We're not sure, we couldn't come down saying, but that is a possibility that has to be considered. And we explain why that's a possibility. The point, though, is that what this spotlighted is that the risk-benefit calculation of basically scouring the wildlife world to try to find pathogens of pandemic potential is relatively high risk, very low benefit. That was our conclusion from our group in our report. That whole research agenda then is questionable. Our group, and some virologists might disagree, but our group believes that the place to do that surveillance is at the crossover point where humans get infected. So then you need to set up a global sentinel surveillance system to really try to spot human crossover. That means you have to deploy that globally, mainly through a network of doctors and hospitals. And Americans basically setting up these medical intelligence agents, that will only work if the people who are in those countries think they're getting something out of that bargain, rather than giving away gene information to Western biopharma industrial complexes. But if you go to them and say you're a hospital in Indonesia and say, we'll give you gene sequencers, we'll give you medical expertise, we'll help you understand the things that are afflicting your people every day, and then what we want out of that bargain is for you to join in this sentinel surveillance program. Now that's the kind of argument that might make sense to a country like Indonesia. And then if you think about that on a global scale, it then requires an entity like CDC to project globally, in some ways the way it used to, a capability that had eroded to some degree globally. And we actually would kind of like to revive a little bit of that, but a number of things would have to happen to get there. By the way, if you hear a suggestion like that and say, well, that actually kind of seems doable. It is. This doesn't require like utopian solutions in which we all sing Kumbaya together. No, this is stuff that actually can be done and at relatively modest cost in comparison to the benefits.
Well, I've got one or two more questions, and then I'll turn out to the audience, so I'll look for hands. So I want to pick up on both those points. I think in the end, the report is optimistic. It seems to suggest that by learning these lessons, you think that the U.S. government, with some of these ideas about how to work internationally, could function. So I want to give you both a chance to give us some more examples of why, or if I've got that wrong, and you're actually deeply pessimistic. But I do think you both are optimistic, or you wouldn't have done this. And then the second might be, how do we get around the politics? You said that Operation Warp Speed worked, but America First didn't. Tell us a little bit more how you see us building a nonpartisan or bipartisan way forward here on that issue. I know it's a layered question. You can pick either part you want to answer. So how do we do this better?
I'll kick this off, then you can bat clean up. I'll try to get a runner on base for you. Look, I work on public problem solving, so you have to be a little bit romantic. You have to be a glass half full kind of person in this, because I'm pretty experienced with this sort of thing. So I'm experienced enough to be cynical. And I know lots of people, including many journalists, who are beyond cynical because, it's like they confront such corrosive and manipulative things all the time, right? So in a way, you don't need any help from me in feeling depressed about public life in America. You can do this all by yourself. The value of our report is not like, let's just make you feel worse and, and further spotlight the tragedy that is our country. No. Actually, you go through this, and another member of our group who's not here, Charity Dean, a public health director in California, said she came away from rereading the book feeling empowered. Because she went through, it's like, you can just see, anyone reading this book, you'll see, like, there are so many things in it that actually we can do that are relatively low-hanging fruit, that don't require a giant remaking of our whole system, on a number of different points, most of which are so unglamorous and technical that they can't possibly be good culture war fodder. You do have to have a vision of what needs to be done, but I think, like in the example of global surveillance, or what Kendall was talking about, I think you can sell that vision to members of Congress. What they won't want to do is, hey, let me just pour a lot more money into the old vessels, which to them are discredited. So you've got to come to them with, say, you know what, we've learned some lessons, and this is what we want to do, and this is why we're trying to do it, and here's why it makes sense. And there's actually a decent chance they'll fund that if it's not some cultural touchstone issue. You're like not asking them to fund the registration of handguns or something. Right? So we're working on that side of public health. But seriously, I think you see the point, is if you go through this, it's actually empowering, because instead of coming away from this terrible pandemic feeling fatalistic, this is just something we have to suffer, or depressed, like this displayed our toxic politics, we're suggesting that actually preparedness can mitigate the toxic politics, and there are a lot of things that are possible to do. And a lot of those things actually don't have a partisan coloration. But they do require understanding what to do and getting ready to do it. And our point about the government right now, it's not that the people in government already know what's in our report. They just don't want to do it because it's politically too hard. No. They actually don't really know what to do. They've been so focused on the detailed day-to-day management of the crisis, looking at it through their soda straws, they don't know what's in this report. They haven't we understand all this, we've considered it no. So the point of the report is, and people will respond to it and improve on different recommendations, and then you get a broader common understanding of what's doable. And I think actually quite a lot of the change is possible if you get that common understanding, which actually includes people in this room.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. And I think, as you said earlier, Philip, our own understanding of these issues is crystallizing as we go. So the process of writing it, the process of reflecting on it, we ourselves, we've been studying this our whole lives, are beginning to understand this in clearer and clearer terms. And one of the things we saw, like with Operation Warp Speed and some of these other improvisations, there are very good people in government still, very good at the public service level, and they have hammers, and we are giving them some nails. We are giving some very, very bite-sized, doable problems. And maybe you're not going to solve everything all at once, but we can solve this piece by piece. And everyone who you saw on that list is working on this in a very direct way, and will continue to, we're going to pull our recommendations together and present them as viable policy options over the next couple of years. And so they can't all fail.
It's hard. It's hard, but you understand that it's hard. You already knew that. So in a way, what you need to learn from us is actually there is stuff that can be done. A lot of it is not very sexy, glamorous stuff, but neither are those emergency preparedness procedures. Actually, quite a lot of practical problem solving in public life is mostly unheard of, unknown, and when it goes well, you never hear about it. except that the professionals understand what to do and they're prepared to do it.
Well, wonderful. I think I'm going to turn to the audience now, and while I'm looking for a hand, yes or no, you want a commission still, or is it too late? Philip?
I was actually asked this question this morning.
He's
Not
buying time.
not here at Dartmouth, no,
No.
by the press, because I think another commission bill is going to be reintroduced, like a commission bill that was reintroduced by the same set of sponsors a year and a half ago. And I think just speaking for the group as a whole, within the group there are mixed feelings about this now. So and it's actually an interesting question. And the mixed feelings are these. Are there a lot of questions on which there could be an exhaustive investigation and more good work done? Yes. Could you talk to a lot more people in greater depth, accessing documents, and do a lot more stuff? Yes. Including even on the origins issue with some places you could go in the United States. So so in theory, could a commission find out more stuff and write a report twice as long, 3 times as long, much more detailed, with more data? Yes. Now, trade-offs. If you create the commission through the government, that the commissioners will be picked by Kevin McCarthy, Chuck Schumer, et cetera. I mean, you can look at the bill. I can tell you here's who will pick the commissioners, and they will pick people who will represent them. So it'll be a highly political group of commissioners. It's actually very hard to do a commission report well. You've heard of the 9/11 report because it was successful. There are a number of commission reports you have not heard of. You can get divided partisan reports. You can get reports that sand down differences and can't really come to direct and forthright conclusions that actually reflect the cacophony of interest groups rather than overcoming them. So then you have, so you can get the advantage, and then there's this disadvantage. Then there's the issue of timeliness. In the best case, you don't get a commission set up. The bill wouldn't pass until late this year, best case. I think actually it's unlikely, but best case. So that means that you don't really get a commission report probably until 2025 at the earliest. So question is there still a political window for action on this that's still standing open in 2025? Our group, when we had to decide whether to go ahead with our own report last year, feared that that window was already closing. Because mainly what the country wants to do is turn the page and put this thing behind us. We're going to declare the end of the public emergency formally the day after tomorrow. You can tell. I mean, you can tell. You all feel it. You see it, and in some ways, you sympathize with it. It was a dismal experience. You want to put it behind you, but then I fear that 2 years from now, I'm not sure there's a political window for action. So those are the kind of the pros and cons a little bit that I've heard from among people in our group. Is that fair to you, Kendall?
It's fair. Those are the political realities. I would just, take it to a slightly different perspective and a slightly different level. We made mistakes, and we can do better. We made more mistakes and bigger mistakes than other high-income countries. We had compared to other European countries of approximately the same size and demographics, we had a 40% higher death rate. So we need to be accountable for that. And to the extent that something like a commission would provide an impetus for some of these higher level changes. I mean, I'm all for hammers and nails and fixing things around the edges, but to the extent that it could provide a little bit more of an impetus for some of these higher level changes, I would like to see it happen. We can do better.
All right, well, fantastic. I think we have someone with a microphone. We have 2 hands up down here in the front. If you could just identify yourself when you ask your question.
I'm Marty Cetron, former CDC and 30 years in this business on the ground in the trenches as well as in the sort of strategic. And first I want to compliment both of you and the rest of your commission for really an excellent and very much needed job. It's the start of that, whether there's an additional commission or not. there's a legitimate debate and pros and cons, as you pointed out. I haven't read it yet, but I just purchased it today, so I could go through it. I'm just wrapping up my decades of government service now. I can tell you that it's spot on in a number of areas, and there also are a number of public servants in government that I think that are also aware of what's wrong, and everyone talks about lessons learned, but really, 100 years ago, there were very similar lessons in 1918 that Howard Markel and I studied in detail about what worked and what didn't work, and some big failures, and occurring in this endemic of a war that had very much colored the 1918 response. I think there's a couple things. So on global surveillance, you're spot on, Philip. In fact, after the first emerging infection report in 1992, it was clear that this was the beginning of a 21st century world in which I can tell you pandemics are increasing in frequency, increasing in duration, increasing in intensity. So the global surveillance tools that we've learned about, we can apply. Wastewater surveillance is a perfect example, a very efficient one like that. And we are now doing wastewater and voluntary surveillance on transportation hubs, which are closer. I think the areas where we've really missed out is we haven't changed the pandemic narrative, at least in this country, and maybe not in many others. And it's all a series of false dichotomies. It's all or nothing, either or, you or me, America first. And we talk about health security and health justice are necessary to be combined, but I don't think we behave and act like that. And until we realize that intra-connectedness, I'm not sure we're going to get the same attitudes toward a war on emerging threats in the biosphere the way we do in that case. So how are we going to change the pandemic narrative from a series of false dichotomies to a series of both ands, parallel processes? That's one real significant gap.
Thanks very much.
Good. I want to stress Marty's point about the global side of this again. And you know what? I'm not going to go and say, oh, it's really in our selfish national interest, and let me tell you why. That argument is there. It's a good argument. But actually, I don't think we should shy away from the straight-up humane moral argument. And actually, I think it's actually in our interest to be good human beings. When you approach the global war, for instance, this is a global pandemic. The make or break in the global coalition will turn on actually about just a handful of countries will be make or break for the strategy. Maybe that shouldn't be so, just as a factual matter. It is so and is likely to remain so. So a handful of countries will determine it one way or the other. One of them is China, actually. United States, Europe, China, India, and after that, so if they work together on the war-winning weapons, but then you'd think, well, then they ought to coordinate procurement. They ought to coordinate, to have the portfolio of assets that we need so that every country isn't trying to do everything itself. And then you'd set, from the outset, our target is to make 12 billion vaccine doses that we're then going to distribute to the world. Look, of course the United States and the European countries will end up making sure their people are taken care of. But there's actually no particular, if you're actually saying, well, let's do 8 billion, no, let's actually make that 12 billion. I mean, and then it actually is strategically sensible and then informs your procurement the whole way. And then if it turns out that people think, well, people are not going to look to the Chinese and the Russian governments to display their universal humanity in leading an effort like this. Maybe they'll look to the Europeans. But the Europeans are actually going to also look at us. They may join hands with us. If they see us going America alone, they will instantly go, it's Europe alone. And that actually played out in the spring of 2020. And I think there were people in the spring of 2020 who, to their great credit, from the start, saw this. And Peter Marks, one of the people who created Warp Speed, actually in March of 2020 said, use CEPI. Use a global conception from the get-go. Now, that got lost in the American government over the next few weeks. But that fundamental conception was both right and wise.
All right. Jim, I think you're up.
Yes, Jim Swan. Jim Swan, I'm a visiting fellow here at the Dickey Center, and just a lay person on these global medical issues, so I would concur. I'm ready to turn the page, and even as a lay person, I know there's a lot that went wrong in our handling of COVID, so thank you for drawing that again to our attention and giving some recommendations on what could be done better. I'm perhaps particularly interested in the practicalities of moving forward on the recommendations, and would like to understand a little bit what you think would be necessary for people to seize on your proposals and carry them forward. Perhaps just an understanding to what extent are you already briefing sitting government officials, people in legislatures. I take it from the short introductions that you've made that there's both a national and a state level and maybe a local level component to it. There's a global component to it. Does this require legislative action? Are these decisions that mostly can be taken within existing executive authorities? Are there other coalitions that somehow need to be built? So I'm assuming that all the recommendations are sound. How do you see carrying this forward so that it's actually implemented, especially because, of course, as you've noted, you're not an official commission where there would be a natural follow-on sequence of activity after your recommendations come
So
through.
let me
what's
just
next?
give a quick example of this. Just this real-life example because it happened this afternoon. Actually, after I left your class,
That was like 20 minutes ago.
Right, I was on a conference call that included Nikki Lurie and Mark McClellan and Beth Cameron.
Okay.
All right. These are all people you and Marty know. And so what's happening right now, literally in real, is people are right now reading and digesting our report and mulling over our recommendations and then lining up our recommendations with their pre-existing beliefs and then, well, I kind of like that, and if they would only tweak it in this way, that's a good process. And that's happening now. And then so, for instance, there are discussions that are already happening in the private sector about how do we build, perhaps here in the private sector, a health data sharing tool that can function as an intermediary between the public health and hospital systems. That's happening right now. People are beginning to talk about that. Also right now, they're saying, Congress is going to have to take action on what the insiders call PAPA, which is the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act renewal. But it's a legislative milestone. They're going to have to work on that in the next few months. And then the question is, well, should we actually try to get some of the roles and mission stuff that's in this report into that bill? Because, whoa. And I said, well, if you're not going to address it in that bill, why even pass the bill? I mean, that's what that legislation is supposed to work on. Oh, and then McClellan said, well, then we should start talking about this right now. And we started talking about it in the conversation. And then I asked Beth Cameron, had the White House asked you to become the new pandemic preparedness czar that Congress just created? And she gave me this diplomatic non-answer, which told me that they've been discussing it with her. So I'm just, these and 50 or 100 conversations like it, if we're lucky, will unfold over the next few months. And then in turn over the next few years. If this becomes kind of a book that gets assigned in classes on public health or about the pandemic, and then there's just a growing awareness of
There's some students in this room
expectations.
that have been assigned this book.
So then this is how behavior changes. It was one of the fascinating things that happened with the 9/11 report is people read it. Millions of people read it. And then congressmen would actually go back and talk to people in their Rotary Club, and they would get questions that made it clear to them that their constituents had read this. That actually has effects. So the honest answer is it's uncertain and we don't know. But we will have succeeded if we ignite a conversation about what can be done, that I think was a conversation that was fixing not to happen at all.
So you don't have a secret team of briefers who are running around the country now to brief, but you're open and available for good ideas and suggestions, it
Well,
sounds
I
like.
would say that everyone up on that list is doing that work now in their own worlds and in their own ways. Because the answer to your question is different for every single issue. And that's the way it's going to proceed. It's Byzantine at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a question for the gentleman over here. Somebody has a microphone? Over here to your right.
Moving around, if I cut the front of it, I think there's going to be feedback. Thank you, and again, I look forward to reading this report and congratulate you on all the work that was done for this. Ford von Rhein, infectious disease and international health at the medical school, and a few decades ago, epidemic investigator for the CDC, the epidemic intelligence or intellectual service. I have a question about what your review has suggested as far as a way to address the executive function issue. And it would seem to me that a single czar without a institution along with them would probably not be very effective. CDC seems like the most effective, the most natural place to have the executive function. But one would imagine that Congress would want some check on what somebody might consider draconian recommendations from an agency like that there'd need to be some check and balance. But do you have a recommendation about the best way forward for the executive function that you've talked about?
Yes, we do actually. We carry it in about as much detail as we think folks could stand to read in a book that's meant to be read by ordinary human beings. Talking about the bureaucratic organization of the government and writing about it is incredibly dull, especially to outsiders. And actually the insiders think the outsiders don't know anything about it anyway, so they'll ignore what you say. So, but your insight actually is an insider's insight. So the point he made was that if you put this kind of, and I'm paraphrasing, if you put this czar outside of one of the line agencies that have congressional accountability, it may not work so well. See, Congress created a White House czar for pandemic readiness in a bill it passed at the end of last year. We're not sure that will work out so well. The Biden White House didn't want this, even though it was in the White House. But Congress gave it to them anyway. And now they're looking at who should fill the job. Our argument in the report is actually to put a much stronger executive function in a line agency. And we think that has to be HHS. Actually, there were disagreements about this in our group, because there are people in our group who've developed pretty jaundiced attitudes about the ability of main HHS to do anything, to be operational about anything. These are not ill-founded objections. But the alternatives of a whole new agency or putting it in DOD, we didn't like either. We don't think the White House solution is a magic wand. So we call for an undersecretary for health security. We think that undersecretary for health security actually should be the orchestra conductor for CDC and the Assistant Secretary of Health and the Office of Global Affairs and relevant aspects of FDA, NIH, what's called the ASPR, all of that. I mean, right now there's in our conversation this afternoon, someone said, well, we're shrugging our shoulders, maybe. You see, the CDC, you can't do this from Atlanta. And in any case, we see the comparative advantage of CDC is in its connections to the state and local agencies, which are longstanding, and its ability to develop and analyze situation awareness. And we think we ought to emphasize CDC's role as your situation awareness network, which then leverages the research mission that it likes to have anyway, and build that up in learning lessons that they can internally learn from the pandemic experience. But the executive function, probably the orchestra conductor, needs to be in Washington. And then someone said, well, I guess we're just going to have to make it the ASPR. Some people here know what that acronym stands for. One of the people on this call was a former ASPR, and she threw up her hands in horror and said, no. So
Why don't you tell us what that means?
the ASPR is the Administration for Preparedness and Response.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's an HHS. It used to be a staff division of HHS. It's now an operating division of HHS. But
Recently, that's a brand new.
right, it's supposed to manage preparedness for a big health emergency. It struggled to do this. Let's just say. Because of its inability actually to choreograph public health, healthcare, and the biopharma side. A lot of the ways, by the way, in which you manage healthcare is through the powerful agency in HHS for healthcare. You don't need a lot of new authorities because they're all there in the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is called CMS, which sets regulations on what you need to do to get Medicare money. I promise you there is no healthcare institution in America that thinks it can dispense with Medicare. So, right. So you've got a lot of latent authorities to do things. It's just a matter of marshaling the authorities with the right executive function. And again, this vision of what it is we need to be ready to do, and then all the things you need to start lining up to be ready to do those things.
And to your question, this is another agent of change. It's another way of getting at some of these reforms. You need somebody to conduct the orchestra. At this point, no one person owns the problem. Everyone has a piece of the problem. But when you can look at it from that perspective, then you can start to turn the gears of government.
I will say that to really embrace this vision, any administration needs to embrace a different kind of HHS and a different kind of HHS secretary than you have right now. Because look, frankly, this is a department that has often simply been seen as overseeing a massive income transfer function, and it just basically it dispenses a lot of money, and that's what it does. Wasn't seen as a place where you put a real policymaker and a real policy executive, and I think we're going to need a different conception of leadership over there.
Right. I've seen a few hands, so I'm going to take a group because then I think we have to turn to final comments. Okay, in no particular order, we had the woman back here. I see Kate. I see the gentleman here in the tie. We start in the back.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Kim Rosenfield. I'm the director of the Technology Transfer Office at Dartmouth. And I wondered if...
Did you say at DARPA?
At Dartmouth.
At Dartmouth.
Close.
Dartmouth.
Here, at Dartmouth.
Really? Because I didn't know DARPA was going to do technology transfer.
DARPA does do tech transfer, actually, but that's a different story. But what we do is we do things like file patents on Jason McClellan's technology, and then we enter into agreements with NIAID and Moderna and BioNTech and so forth to get the technology out of the lab and into the marketplace. And what I wondered is whether in your analysis and investigation you explored the role of intellectual property protections and licensing in the response to the pandemic.
Okay. And before you answer that, I'm going to take two more. I think I see Kate back here.
Thank you. Are we not on? Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. Thank you both for being here and for this wonderfully engaging and accessible presentation. I'm interested in hearing from one or both of you about one of your most surprising findings in this report.
Okay. Let's check. I actually have two more people, this gentleman, and then I think we had someone back here too.
Hi, I'm Rich Rothstein. I'm the chair of medicine here and a senior associate dean for clinical affairs at Geisel. And I wanted to follow up on Ford's question, but I didn't hear you talk at all about the Surgeon General. And we've had a previous Surgeon General affiliated with Dartmouth who had quite an impact on the war on tobacco, the war on AIDS. And I know that's the current discussions about loneliness. There's a war on loneliness that just happened this week. But the question is, what role can that Surgeon General play? Not as an institution like the CDC or many of the other institutions we're talking about, but as an individual who could help the country to sort of rally around the idea that this hasn't gone away, this war is not over, the COVID is not gone, and we have to be ready for the next events. And so I'm just wondering if you might address that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. The gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm Dan Lucy, a public health infectious physician. I worked at various places and taught in Washington, D.C. From 1990 to a year ago when I returned to teach here at Dartmouth, at the college and at the Geisel, the medical center, Dartmouth Institute. So I've read your book. I really enjoyed it, page by page, made notes on each page. Glad to talk with you at another time. One point I want to emphasize, though, that I thought could be emphasized more in the book is what happened with Operation Warp Speed was incredible, as you said, and I think we all agree. But what I thought didn't get enough discussion was the use of the FDA's emergency use authorization to make the 2 mRNA vaccines that Kendall said were available within 11 months. Available to the American population. So I think that was a really important first, really, the use of the FDA's emergency use authorization for vaccines. And then the last thing is I'd just like to say that, your first point about that you made, Philip, was about 21st century pandemic and 19th century public health infrastructure. And I agree with you up to a point, but I'd say that in the 21st century, we've had at least 2, before COVID, 2 respiratory pandemics. So SARS-1, 2003, and then, of course, the H1N1 true pandemic in 2009-10. And I think that neither one of them hit America as much as they hit other places. And I think that what you emphasize in the book is really important in terms of what's different in terms of asymptomatic spread and in terms of aerosol transmission. And I think those 2 things really fooled a lot of Americans, including Tony Fauci and others that you've mentioned that were on the call with you earlier today. And I think that that's what we should be preparing for from a scientific infectious disease point of view, the asymptomatic and aerosol spread. And if it's something that's more deadly, like, say, an engineered Nipah virus that affects the brain, that's going to be much, much worse than anything that we've seen so far.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And is there one more in the back here?
The bulk of our online questions have been answered already. Good job. The focus here is on a pathogen then and the future pathogen we might or will face. But arguably, we have multiple pathogens causing massive disease right now. War, poverty, economic and racial injustice, gun violence, education failures, health system failures, climate change catastrophes, just to name a few. These pandemics are more complex and resistant to cure and need the same kind of national and global responses that you promoted. Don't you agree that these lessons apply equally to non-viral pandemics?
All right. So what I'd like to suggest is that's a lot to ask each of you to address. So why don't you pick out a few? And this unfortunately have to be our wrap-up because I'm very excited. We will have a book signing after this event. And so you're all welcome to join us to have conversation and look at the books after this. Kendall, would you like to start off?
Okay, how long have I got?
Well, we theoretically end in 1 minute, so why don't you take a few more than that?
Well, I would say intellectual property is a totally fascinating and fraught question, and I would love to have a sidebar with you on that. It was often accused as being the reason that we had reduced access. And in this particular pandemic, the real friction was in technology transfer. which these companies were ready and willing to transfer the technology, but they did not have the staff that had to travel with the technology. You cannot fax over a blueprint. It doesn't work like that. And so it wasn't what actually prevented access and innovation this time around. There are other kinds of pandemics, other kinds of markets, other kinds of technologies in which that might not be true. And you can negotiate access up front when you're contracting for that research. And that is a growing field of research, which is very interesting. But it's upfront, not after, right? You don't want to disincentivize by revoking something like that after someone's already made an investment. Skipping ahead to the EUA, I think the FDA is an unsung hero in this. What they did was absolutely remarkable. They worked around the clock. They processed data in real time. They stepped outside of their comfort zone. It was not business as usual. And they reevaluated cost and benefit. And they did not put everything to a peacetime high standard. It wasn't that it was unsafe. It was extremely safe. They maintained an extremely strict standard, but they also took into account the broader atmosphere. What's the risk of not having it? Which was very forward-looking and creative and insightful, an example of something that I think we can be proud of and did well. So I take your point. And then skipping ahead to the big, broad pandemics of all kinds. I think, Bill Gates talks about building a better fire department, just fight pandemics of this kind. And I think, generally speaking, I think we also need to think about the ways in which we are making our society more flammable. And it's not just about viruses, it's about animal husbandry, it's about deforestation, it's about a million policies and practices that we make every day that carry a cost. And what I hope this pandemic does is help us be more cognizant of the very mundane, costly decisions that we make every day. If you average out, let's just talk about viral pandemics for a minute, average them all out, the big and the small, pandemics cost the world $800 billion a year. And you could come up with a number for gun violence. You could come up with a number for, various pollution practices. They all carry a cost, and I hope we can start to reconceptualize some of these policy choices.
Very good.
Yeah.
Philip, I think she's left you at least two. One is, what's your biggest surprise? And the second, what about the Surgeon General?
I guess it's actually hard for me to remember now what was the biggest surprise, honestly. But I'd say overall the biggest surprise is all the evidence of success stories that I did not know about. There are just a lot of very particular stories of improvisations and patches and other things where people who I had not heard of before did ingenious things, and it kind of gave me a little bit of a passion that some of these lessons aren't going to be lost. The Surgeon General point is really interesting and important. During this particular crisis, the Surgeon General did not cover himself with glory. He gave a masking guidance he would like to take back, but there were other things. But really the role of the Surgeon General, what is the role of the Surgeon General? And beyond that, what is the role of the Public Health Service? Is this supposed to be some corps of federal regulars in our health army? Or is this just people who we send to work on Indian reservations and the occasional quarantine job? In this crisis, the Public Health Service was peripheral. Really? We had a pandemic and we have a public health service and it plays this peripheral role. The Surgeon General's role was, if not mischievous, peripheral. So is their job is just to make sonorous pronouncements about preventive health to avoid loneliness and other fine homilies? Or Do we actually want to have a vision in which we have some sort of core of federal regulars that give us some national capabilities to meet a national emergency that can help provide some spine for a much larger and sprawling national setup? That's why I think actually when we can reconceive the reforms out of this, I think we need to reconceive the role of the Surgeon General. And I think we need to reconceive the role and scale and mission of the Public Health Service, which right now is under the Assistant Secretary for Health. And that's one of the reasons why I think that particular office in HHS needs to become part of the conversation.
Well, thank you. I want to thank my colleagues at the Dickey Center. I want to thank all of you who have joined us this evening, particularly to Kendall for helping us create the Pandemic Security Project, and to you and Philip for what you've accomplished with this report and the conversations you're trying to start all over the country and internationally. We look forward to being one of the first, but certainly not the last. Count us as allies, and a great book. I recommend it to everybody. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.